Food shortages, looting and violent protests as the economic crisis in Venezuela deepens. Are President Maduro's policies to blame, and can he stop the country's complete collapse? Also on today's program, Afghanistan's blue treasure, how lapis lazuli is being mined in remote areas to the Taliban's benefit. And in Picture This, the protests in Macedonia being dubbed the colourful revolution, why paint is being used by demonstrators angry at political corruption. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Asha Tanner. When Nicolas Maduro took over as Venezuelan president in 2013, he vowed to keep the Bolivarian revolution of his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, alive. But it hasn't been an easy ride at the top for the former bus driver. A slump in oil prices has helped fuel an economic crisis so severe, he's called in the army to control food supplies. Inflation is expected to soar above 700% this year, and looting, lynchings and violent protests are also on the rise. President Maduro is now battling for his political survival as the opposition pushes for a recall referendum. But Maduro is vowing to hold on, blaming Washington for the country's problems. On Newsmaker today is President Nicolas Maduro as we ask if his own policies are to blame for the country's economic meltdown.
These are desperate times. Each day is a struggle for food and basic medicines. Crime is rampant and politicians are at war. President Maduro is fighting to keep the socialist revolution of his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, alive, and says foreign interests are sabotaging the economy.
Venezuela no se va a doblegar, y si nos pretenden acorralar, vamos a pelear de frente.
There are fears in Caracas of a political coup as the opposition moves to oust Maduro in a referendum.
But as the crisis here deepens, the world is asking what went wrong. How did one of the world's richest oil nations become an economic basket case?
Everyone agrees that low oil prices have had a huge impact on Venezuela's economy. During the Chavez years, oil prices were high and climbed further under Maduro's presidency to $100 a barrel before dropping to a low of $30. Venezuela has become more dependent on oil exports, which now make up 95% of its income. And here's where the politics come in. Critics blame Chavez's socialist policies for heavily subsidizing oil and petrol, for crippling private businesses and national industry, and general overspending. Chavistas say money was spent on social programs which benefited the poor, and blamed today's shortages on the United States and on local businesses trying to bring down the government. The question now is whether Venezuela's so-called social revolution can survive growing discontent. President Nicolas Maduro's popularity has plummeted to under 29%. The opposition believes it can win a referendum to oust him, but accuses the government of delaying a vote.
Nosotros no podemos ir a un diálogo simplemente para que Maduro gane tiempo o Maduro se lave la cara, que es, por lo visto, ha sido el único espíritu.
President Maduro has now enforced a state of emergency, giving the army control over public security and food distribution. But the biggest fear is that new measures to contain the crisis will create even more chaos, and that Venezuela's climate of violence could become worse. Annelise Borges, The Newsmakers, Caracas.
Well, joining me now to discuss the situation in Venezuela and whether Maduro is to blame is Gregory Wilpert. He is the co-founder of VenezuelaAnalysis.com. He joins me from Friedrichshafen in Germany and in Miami. A Venezuelan lawyer and writer, Raul Stolk. Welcome to the program, both of you. I'll start with you, Gregory Wilpert. Is Maduro to blame?
Well, the blame, I think, is very complicated. It has something to do with the fact that in 2002 there was a coup attempt which forced President Chavez to introduce a currency control. The currency control worked for a long time. However, there was a point in 2012 and 2013 when Maduro took office that he really should have changed that and changed it to a more flexible exchange rate, a market-based rate. And so in that sense, yes, he does carry a large part of the blame for not having changed that currency control back when he first took office. And since then, the situation certainly has gotten worse. But it has roots that go much deeper and are more complicated than just saying that it's Maduro's fault.
OK, Raul Stolk, you're rolling your eyes there about the currency control. Did Nicolas Maduro, though, inherit a poison chalice?
Yeah, well, the thing here is that I agree that the currency control should have been lifted years ago, but not 3 years ago. It should have been lifted 7, 8 years ago. The measure the currency control measure shouldn't have gone more than 2 or 3 years. Chavez's policies blew up in Maduro's face, and even if Maduro wanted to, and I believe that in the beginning he did want to make changes to make things better, he wasn't able because of these different interests, which basically have to do with people taking advantage of corruption generated by the regulations imposed by the government during the Chavez years.
OK, Gregory Wilpert, you heard it there. It's blown up in his face. I mean, critics have called this a man-made humanitarian crisis. This is as far as a socialist utopia gets. If we look at the facts on the ground, they've got a 2-day working week. The military is patrolling supermarkets. Health officials say malnutrition amongst children is on the rise. Inflation is out of control. He's been in power 3 years. Has he been too slow to act?
Well, I would certainly agree that he's been slow to act. However, some of these things are not of Maduro's making. For example, the 2-day working week is the result of a drought that has been in effect in Venezuela for almost 3 years now, and has reduced Venezuela's electricity supply tremendously because it depends on a massive hydroelectric dam. So that's not entirely Maduro's fault. Certainly more investment could have been made in energy supply, but it wasn't exactly predictable that this would have happened. But certainly, I mean, the other things, of course, Raul mentions the different interests that are in place. I mean, what he's talking about is politics, and that's you have that in any government in the world, that you have different competing interests within a government. But that's not really a cause of the problem. The cause is really that Maduro has been trying to mediate all kinds of different interests, and he's been very slow in making a decisive decision one way or the other on which way to go. Chavez was a much more decisive president, and I think if he had been still in power, he would have solved the problem relatively quickly. But Maduro has been trying to balance all kinds of different interests, and one of the main problems is that the government strongly believes that any kind of currency devaluation or giving in to the market economy would be a concession of defeat, which of course it would be to some extent. And so he's been very reluctant to make that decision and is trying to compensate, trying to resolve the problem by taking many different other measures, such as trying to improve domestic production in order to supply the markets and overcome the shortages. I think there's some light at the end of the tunnel right now, though, because oil prices are slowly going up again, and the government has also introduced a new exchange rate that has stopped the black market exchange rate from rising. So that's a tremendous advance. It's not enough, but it's certainly a major improvement in the situation right now, because that will have a good chance of slowing inflation and making the situation a little bit better. But like I said, it's definitely not enough, and if it doesn't make more decisive changes soon, he could face definitely a severe challenge with regard to the recall referendum later this year.
Raul Stokes, I know you want to comment on the exchange rate and possibly even the oil.
First, the problem with the electric grid, there was a huge investment. Billions of dollars were invested in the Venezuelan electric grid. The reason of the shortages does not have to do with the drought. It has to do with first, a bad planification with respect to that huge investment in the electric grid, and corruption. Companies that were supposed to upgrade the grid and didn't do what they were, didn't do the quality of work that they were required to do. And right now what's been happening, part of the things that have to do with the government, for instance, not giving, trying to block the efforts of the National Assembly, the new parliament, to fix the situation, is that there is a lot of accountability on the government side.
Okay, let's bring in Gregory Wilpert just to address those issues.
As far as the recall referendum is concerned, of course, the current government is going to do everything that it can to stop it, but it's not up to the current government, really. It's up to the National Electoral Council and also up to the actions of the opposition. That is, the opposition has to collect the required number of signatures by certain deadlines. They turned in the signatures very late in the game. They should have done it back in January when they had when it was first possible to start collecting signatures for a recall referendum. They didn't turn them in until May, and so that makes it questionable as to whether or not there will actually be a referendum before the end of the year. I think it's still theoretically possible, but it's not definite because, as I said, it takes a lot of time to organize the referendum based on the different guidelines that were set up back in 2007. And so if it happens after the end of the year, that is in January next year, then that means the vice president would take over, and obviously the opposition is trying to prevent that. But I would say they shot themselves in the foot in that regard, because they could have started collecting them much sooner.
It is not true that it takes 1 year to set up a recall referendum. And it is not true that the opposition did the signature collection process late. The government has been actually blocking the efforts of the opposition through the electoral administration to at all costs avoid having the referendum in 2016. Because if we have the referendum this year, it will be obligatory to call for a new presidential election.
Okay.
If we have the referendum in 2017, then the vice president would finish, PSUV's vice president would finish Maduro's term.
Okay, final thoughts now. Gregory Wilpert, 70% of people want Maduro to go. That's according to recent polls. Should he just go?
Well, actually, 30% support is actually relatively high compared to many other presidents in Latin America. Dilma Rousseff, who was recently temporarily removed, had something like 10 or 15% support, and other presidents, for example, the president of Peru, also regularly enjoyed less than 20% support. So, in that sense, as far as Latin America is concerned, and even President Bush in the last years of his office was, I think, under 30%. So that's not something unusual in a democracy that our president should have support, and that by itself is certainly not enough to justify his resignation or his removal from office. Rather, what needs to be done is that the democratic process needs to be followed, and the constitutional process, which provides for a recall referendum. By the way, I should remind people that Venezuela is, as far as I know, the only country in the world that allows for a recall referendum against a sitting president, which President Chavez faced in 2004, and perhaps, if all goes well, President Maduro will face at the end of this year. So that will go forward, I think. I can't say for certain if it'll happen before the end of this year or early next year, but if the opposition follows the rules, I think, and also the government, that is the Electoral Council, then it will happen. But that's completely independent of the fact of what popularity rating President Maduro has.
Okay, and Raul Stolk, if the opposition do take power eventually, is this likely to be the beginning of austerity measures that could in fact hit the most vulnerable in society? What reassurance do they have?
The actual problem that we have right now won't be fixed by the referendum, because we have a crisis right now that if it is not addressed today, perhaps we'll not even get to the referendum because of civil unrest, and I don't know what could happen down there. So it is very important that the government right now empowers the National Assembly stop blocking their efforts to fix the situation and find a way to work together to address the crisis that's going down right now. I don't think there's time right now for political tangos and processes that will take 6 months for a crisis that has dying babies because of the scarcity of medicine, that has people starving because of 70% scarcity of food, and that has conflict in the streets because the government empowered civilian groups to control the supply of food in the city, for instance. I think that if the crisis is not addressed right now, we'll see several events like this in the following months.
Okay, Gregory Wilpert and Raul Stolk, thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, how the Afghan Taliban is cashing in on a semi-precious stone. And in Picture This, the protesters in Macedonia literally painting the town red. After 15 years of war and promises of development, Afghanistan's economy is still largely dependent on foreign aid. It was hoped the country's mineral sector would pull Afghanistan away from its US dollar addiction. One of the plans was to mine lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone which has been extracted for centuries in Afghanistan, but militia control the mountains where it can be found. And the Taliban is said to be making millions from the illegal mining operations. Soraya Leni explains.
It's supposed to be the economic hope of a nation, the one legal industry that Afghanistan's economy is meant to be built on, mining.
Our preliminary information, which still needs to be investigated, is that the total value of Afghan mines and minerals is $3 trillion.
But not only is the sector failing, it's fueling further conflict in the country. A new report shows that the Taliban is earning up to $20 million per year just from Afghanistan's ancient lapis lazuli mines. The deep blue stone has been used in jewelry and artifacts for thousands of years, including on Egyptian King Tutankhamun's death mask. It's mined primarily in Badakhshan province, in Afghanistan's northeast, but much of it is controlled by local militia.
It's very heartening that Afghanistan has a very bright future if the Afghan mineral reserves are properly extracted, and we hope that this will be a resource for Afghanistan which will make Afghanistan self-sufficient.
But the only group that's really benefiting is the Taliban, not the government. Mining is the Taliban's second biggest source of money after heroin. The problem is most of the country is in a state of war or upheaval, and according to watchdogs, corruption is rampant. Since the US invasion in 2001, the US has injected more than $100 billion into the country, including $488 million for extractive industries. But 15 years later, critics say the Afghan government still seems to be extracting more from foreign aid than from its own country, and militia control of this blue stone is denying Afghanistan much-needed jobs and revenue. Soraya Leni, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to explain how illegal mining is fueling the conflict in Afghanistan is Stephen Carter. He is the Afghanistan Campaign leader for Global Witness and co-author of a new report on this. He joins me from London. Welcome to the programme. Stephen, how easy has it been for the Taliban to take control of this sector?
Well, it's not just the Taliban. There are actually several armed groups in this area, and actually, in a sense, they're working together on this. There's a sort of perverse sort of cooperation between groups that should be against the Taliban and the Taliban themselves. So 2 years ago, this mining area was taken over by an armed group which is led by a former chief of police, so a government official. He took it over from the de facto control, according to our research, of a member of parliament who worked under the cover of an official government armed force there. And both of those groups apparently have been contributing or contributed to the Taliban. So you have a witch's brew. You have a sort of mix of armed groups of, which are unofficial, which have a sort of government cover, and which are insurgents, and all of them cooperating in a way to create the conditions in which illegal extraction can go ahead. And that creates an enormous benefit, because actually, of those three groups, it's the Taliban who are best able to exploit those conditions and grow their strength to the point where now they actually control more than 50% of the revenue that's being paid by the miners to access the mines. That's millions of dollars a year going to the Taliban and making them very strong in a province where before they had very little presence at all, even at the height of their power before 2001.
It's a huge amount of money that they are creaming off, shall we say. How do you stamp out corruption in a country that has so much instability?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, the government faces an enormous challenge here because these resources are making a lot of money for people, and the interests involved are very powerful. But there are some basic things that the government can do and which it isn't doing. I think it's important, first of all, to recognise, though, that they have been making some stronger efforts in this area. They've made some very good commitments. We think they're taking the problem more seriously than has been the case for a very long time. And that deserves recognition and support. However, the basic things that could be done and which aren't being done, these are things which are really frontline protections against corruption and conflict around the natural resource sector, the first things you want to be doing and which aren't yet in place. So particularly, there's sort of two big areas. First of all, in the security policy of the government, what level of priority do they give to this sector? Because you can't really have legal mining unless you have control over the mining areas. And what our research shows is that these areas are disproportionately important in terms of the security of the country. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that government control on its own is useless. As we saw, there was government control before, but all the research we did showed that there was illegal extraction then as well, benefiting an armed group. And so what you need is you need the rule of law in these areas. And that's a difficult thing to do, but there are measures that can really help. So that's largely around two big areas. First of all, transparency, that you have, for example, the publication of contracts as a condition of their validity for the mining sector. That you have the automatic publication of the production and payment data from all these mines, that you have an automatic publication of the beneficial owners, the real owners of the contracts, because our research again found that the mining contracts that existed in this area were controlled by people who had no right to control them. And then the second big area is that you have communities being involved in the benefits from these mines and also in overseeing them, so that you can actually create a political incentive for legal extraction. If you can give people a benefit from those mines, then they will help to defend them. It's not a silver bullet in any way, but it is something that can make a real difference to these, to make these resources actually provide a benefit for the Afghan people.
OK, Stephen Carter in London, thank you very much. In today's Picture This, the president of Macedonia has caved into public pressure and revoked the pardons of public officials who are under criminal investigation. It follows weeks of protests. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, as we asked if he was to blame for the country's deepening economic crisis. Maduro took over as president in 2013, promising to maintain the policies of his predecessor Hugo Chavez. But a slump in oil prices has seen revenues fall dramatically and food shortages so severe, he's called in the army to control food supplies. You've been watching this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Asha Tanna. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.